Now let me tell you about crucifixion. It was the most horrific, shameful, public way to die. The ancient historian Josephus, who himself was Jewish, he talks about it as the most wretched of deaths. Cicero said that decent Roman citizens shouldn't even speak of crucifixion because it was so barbarous and horrific that Romans not only avoided crucifixion, it was for those who were foreigners. They shouldn't even speak of it. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 22 and 23, God declares, "Cursed is anyone who is hung on a tree." So for the Jews, it can't get any worse. Crucifixion, however, happened all the time. For example, on the day that Spartacus fell in battle, 6,000 people were crucified in one day along roughly a 120-mile stretch of highway. If you could even imagine jumping on, let's say, I-5 and driving for 2 hours, and along the way, on the shoulder of the road, there were interspersed 6,000 bleeding, weeping, suffering, dying people. One day, 6,000 people were crucified. They did this in public places, places that there was shopping, places where people were gathering so that they could maximize the crowds. Additionally, the worst people would come to watch these events. They would make sport, they would make light, they would make fun. Guys would have drinks, they'd place bets about whether or not they'd become incontinent and mess their pants or urinate. They'd place bets as to whether or not they would cry and whine. They'd place bets on the over-under for how fast they would breathe their last and die. And while this happened, people's mothers were there, their brothers and sisters and friends, and that was the case at Jesus' own crucifixion. He looked down and there was his mom and he spoke to her. Jesus certainly knew what crucifixion was. He possibly even witnessed it as a little boy. Around the year 4 AD, there was a Jewish uprising, and the Roman government put down that revolt with a massive crucifixion. Can you imagine what it was like for Jesus as a little boy, an elementary school kid? Maybe out playing one day, and he sees a bunch of people crucified. And he realizes, that's where I'm going. That's what it's going to look like. That's what it's going to feel like. And he kept going. Crucifixion was, generally speaking, death by asphyxiation. As a man was crucified, he was crucified through the most sensitive nerve centers on the human body, the hands and the feet, with the equivalent of railroad ties. The result being that the body would slouch on the cross, and then the man's lungs would eliminate the oxygen, and the man would pass in and out of consciousness. See, sometimes women were crucified, but not generally, and when women were crucified, they were crucified backwards with their face facing the cross because they didn't want to see a woman's face, but men were turned around. And unlike a lot of the pictures, men were generally not crucified high, they were crucified low so everybody could look them in the eye and make fun of them. And so a man would pass in and out of consciousness. And as he would pass unconscious, slouching on the cross, as the oxygen was exhaled from his lungs, he would then come to and push himself up on the cross. This could go on, history records, for as long as 9 days. Dehydration, delirium. Off the body would be dripping blood and sweat and tears and urine and feces because you couldn't even control your bodily functions. Some people tried to hasten their death, and they would just try and slouch. So they, insofar as we could tell archaeologically, they'd put a seat underneath their buttocks to hold them up to make it last as long as possible. After they died, the bodies were often just discarded. Some historians record that occasionally a stray dog would bring a foot or a hand home. Friends, this is what we did to God.